They dissected living people without anesthesia, cutting open bodies to observe organs while the victims struggled and screamed. They froze limbs until the flesh turned black, then smashed them with hammers to study how bones shattered. They injected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid, watching the infections spread in real time. These were not the actions of demons or monsters. They were the documented procedures of Unit 731, an elite military medical unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. And the horrors that took place inside their walls were among the most brutal ever recorded in human history. They locked men, women, and children inside pressure chambers, watching their eyes burst as the internal pressure climbed. They strapped prisoners to stakes and tested grenades on their bodies, measuring shrapnel impact at various distances. They forced victims to drink seawater until their organs failed. These were precise experiments, carried out with surgical discipline. Every scream, every heartbeat, every death was recorded in detailed protocols. Unit 731 wasn't a rumor. It wasn't wartime propaganda. It was a biological weapons program staffed by doctors, scientists, and military officers, many educated in top universities. Their goal was simple: develop the most efficient methods of killing large populations. Their methods, however, were beyond comprehension. Unit 731 was founded in 1936 by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a charismatic microbiologist who believed biological warfare could secure Japan's dominance in Asia. Ishii was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly devoid of empathy. He recruited top doctors and researchers, promising them unlimited resources, no ethical restrictions, and the opportunity to reshape warfare. They accepted eagerly. The facility was built in Pingfang, near the city of Harbin in occupied China. On paper, it was a water purification unit. In reality, it was a sprawling complex with laboratories, crematoriums, autopsy rooms, frostbite chambers, pressure chambers, and outdoor testing fields. Barbed wire, guard towers, and patrols surrounded it. Inside, thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Korean captives, Mongolians, Russians, and sometimes allied POWs became human subjects. The Japanese doctors called them maruta, meaning logs. To them, the prisoners were not human, they were materials. The experiments began with vivisections, dissections on living people. Doctors infected prisoners with deadly diseases, waited for symptoms to develop, then strapped them to tables and cut them open without anesthesia. They examined lungs filled with fluid, livers swollen with infection, intestines rotting from within. They wanted to see how organs changed minute by minute as diseases advanced. Anesthesia would corrupt the data, so they didn't use it. One doctor later admitted that he vivisected prisoners while they were still screaming, their hearts still beating under his scalpel. Another recalled dissecting pregnant women to study fetal infection. Infants were vivisected too. Frostbite experiments were among Unit 731's signature horrors. Prisoners had their arms or legs exposed to sub-zero temperatures. Guards poured water over the skin to accelerate the freezing. When the limbs froze solid, producing a sound like wood when struck, doctors shattered the frozen flesh with sticks. They observed how gangrene formed, how tissue died, how bones fractured. They repeated the process again and again, sometimes freezing and thawing the same limb, until the victim died from infection or shock. Unit 731 also explored the limits of human endurance. They placed prisoners in centrifuges to see how much spinning force would tear organs apart. They locked victims in pressure chambers, raising internal pressure until lungs collapsed and blood vessels burst. They dehydrated prisoners to death, refusing water until their skin peeled from dryness. They exposed victims to flamethrowers at measured distances to test burn patterns. They tested poisons by injecting toxins into prisoners' veins, mixing them with meals, spraying them into chambers. Victims convulsed, lost vision, hallucinated, and died in agony. Every reaction was noted carefully. Doctors debated data as if discussing routine lab results. Disease experiments were the most expansive. Ishii's teams cultivated plague-infested fleas by the millions. They infected prisoners with plague by injecting bacteria, exposing them to contaminated aerosols, or letting fleas bite them. Victims developed huge black buboes, high fevers, and uncontrollable bleeding. When they died, usually within days, their bodies were dissected and burned. Anthrax, cholera, dysentery, typhus, smallpox, all were tested on living humans. Entire buildings were dedicated to producing pathogens. Researchers walked through hallways carrying bowls filled with plague cultures as casually as carrying soup. Mass field tests were even more terrifying. Japanese aircraft flew over Chinese villages, dropping ceramic bombs filled with infected fleas or bacterial slurry. Witnesses described black clouds bursting in the air, followed by outbreaks that killed hundreds. Some estimates suggest that tens of thousands of civilians died in plague epidemics intentionally triggered by Unit 731. Gas chambers were used to test chemical weapons. Prisoners were marched inside and exposed to mustard gas, phosgene, and nerve agents. Doctors observed blister formation, lung damage, and respiratory failure. Survivors rarely lasted long. Their bodies were cremated in furnaces connected directly to the labs. Outdoor weapon tests were conducted in firing ranges. Prisoners were tied to stakes while soldiers fired rifles, machine guns, and flamethrowers at them to measure ballistic effects. Grenades were placed at set distances from bound victims to study fragmentation patterns. Sometimes prisoners were ordered to run so researchers could observe the effects of different wounds while the body was in motion. Pregnant women were deliberately infected with diseases to study fetal transmission. Babies born infected were often dissected immediately. If they survived childbirth, they were used for biological tests. Their remains, like all victims, were burned. Throughout all this, the doctors operated with chilling efficiency. They discussed test results calmly, argued over data, and documented everything in thousands of pages of reports. They believed their work was scientific progress. Some even wrote that the screams of their victims were useful indicators of nerve function. The number of victims is still debated, but most historians estimate between 3,000 and 12,000 people died inside Unit 731. If you count those killed by biological attacks, the number climbs into the hundreds of thousands. As the war turned against Japan, Unit 731 ramped up its work. Ishii planned large-scale biological attacks on the United States, including releasing plague fleas on the West Coast. The plan was never executed, but the preparations were real. When Japan began to lose Manchuria, Ishii ordered all remaining prisoners killed. Guards shot anyone who could walk. Others were burned alive inside buildings. Documents were destroyed. Equipment was blown up. Ishii and his senior doctors fled, leaving behind charred ruins and mass graves. But the most disturbing chapter came after the war ended. The United States discovered the existence of Unit 731 and the scale of its experiments. American intelligence officers interviewed Ishii and his team. They collected data, reports, and testimonies. What they found was unprecedented, a complete record of human experimentation impossible to replicate ethically. And then the U.S. made a decision that remains one of the darkest political bargains in history. Instead of charging Ishii and his doctors with war crimes, the U.S. granted them immunity. In exchange, the doctors handed over all their research, every protocol, every disease experiment, every chart documenting human suffering. Not a single member of Unit 731 was convicted. Shiro Ishii lived freely, practiced medicine, and died peacefully in 1959. Many of his colleagues became professors, physicians, and businessmen. Their victims were never acknowledged by name. Their families were never compensated. Their suffering was buried beneath politics. But the legacy of Unit 731 remains a reminder that science without morality becomes horror, that intelligence without empathy breeds monsters, that doctors, trained to heal, can become executioners when given power without accountability. Unit 731 did not simply break ethical boundaries, it erased them. It proved that some of the worst atrocities in history were not committed in darkness by madmen, but in laboratories by people in white coats, holding clipboards, speaking the language of science while performing acts of unimaginable cruelty. History remembers Unit 731 not as a military unit, not as a scientific institution, but as a factory of death, a place where human beings were reduced to data points, where suffering was measured in charts, and where compassion was replaced by cold calculation. And long after the smoke cleared, after the furnaces cooled, after the graves filled, the truth remained. These were not experiments. They were murders, performed with precision, documented with pride, and justified in the name of progress.